Welcome back to Recruiting Blitz. My name's Verghese. We appreciate you guys tuning in. Before we get started, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and be sure to check out our work over at InsideNebraska.com. There's a lot happening right now on the recruiting trail. We're gearing up for a busy June of official visits and camps and a couple other recruiting events. So be sure to check out our work over there. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we're just ramping up and a lot happening right now. Coaches are on the road still. Guys are scheduling official visits, and we've got practically daily updates at this point on everything that's happening on the recruiting trail right now. We've got a bit of a different episode for you guys today. Like I mentioned, things are happening, but it's more day-to-day stuff. Be sure to check out our stuff at Inside Nebraska, the Insiders Board. We've got daily updates practically on checking in on the coaching staff, where they are as they're visiting these schools, new official visit dates as they come out, and so much more. And so be sure to check that out. But today I wanted to focus on some of the recruiting rivals Nebraska keeps running into on the recruiting trail. Obviously, want to touch on the local rivals, the Iowas, the Missouris, the Oklahomas, and those are teams Nebraska's going to go up against for recruits practically every single cycle. But I also wanted to touch on some of the national programs we're seeing Nebraska running into time and time again, specifically here in this 26th cycle, just to give an indication of where Nebraska is as a program, the type of battles they're in for some of their top targets, and some of these schools they're going to be battling not just this year but for years to come. So we're going to get right into it. Talk about first the local rival, Iowa. Not as many Iowa-Nebraska battles this cycle, just a handful, but they are important. Iowa got an early win on Nebraska, landing four-star interior offensive lineman Hudson Parliament at the time, in the fall was Nebraska's top interior line target. He had been Nebraska's top interior line target for some time. His commitment to Iowa came as a shock, but it's hard to see guys moving off, pledges to the Hawkeyes. I don't think he's going anywhere. I think he's pretty set in that commitment. I could see Nebraska, potentially trying to circle back in the fall, but at this point, I think he's just set to go to Iowa, and that was a tough loss for Nebraska. Something that they've been able to expand to the interior O line board and add some names to that, but that was a tough loss, no doubt. The other big battle between these two programs is for Darian Jones, younger brother of Donovan Jones, rising cornerback out of Omaha North. Can't play safety, can't play corner, legit 6'2" DB. Nebraska likes a lot. They offered this spring. And, this is an interesting one. Jones, obviously his older brother plays at Nebraska right now, but Jones himself grew up an Iowa fan. He's got family members that go to Iowa, that are fans of Iowa. And it is going to be, I think, a true head-to-head battle here between the Hawkeyes and the Huskers. Minnesota's involved a little bit, but I do think this comes down to the Hawkeyes and the Huskers. Nebraska got obviously just the in-state, the proximity to home on their side, the fact that he'll have another opportunity to play with his older brother. I think those are appealing things to him. But Iowa, is made him feel like a priority. They were on him before Nebraska was, and I think they've really pushed the idea that he can go play for the school he grew up rooting for, and potentially play on the other side of the line of his brother. And so that's going to be a recruitment we're going to be watching very closely in June. He's scheduled to make official visits to both programs next month. The other Iowa-Nebraska battle is for three-star linebacker Casey Thomas out of Sioux City, Bishop Heelan. But this isn't really an Iowa-Nebraska battle. This is an Iowa State battle, and Nebraska's kind of running in third. At least that's how it is right now going into the month of June. I think Nebraska's scheduled to get him on an official visit. So is Iowa. So is Iowa State. I think Nebraska's going to get a very fair shot to impress him and potentially surge. But as we're entering June, this is an Iowa State battle. I think Iowa State has the edge on the Hawkeyes right now, but just another one that these same programs are battling for. And yeah, I think right now Thomas ends up at Iowa State, but I think also official visits are going to be pretty decisive for him, and could shake some things around. But those are really the Iowa Nebraska battles. I think we're going to see a lot more moving forward. 2027, they're in on a couple of the same targets. 2028, there's already a few Iowa prospects Nebraska's offered and in on. It's a good cycle for linemen out of the state of Iowa, that cycle. So I think you're going to see Nebraska and Iowa continue to duke it out, but they're not Nebraska's biggest rival in the region, at least for the 2026 cycle. That goes to Missouri. Missouri and Nebraska have been battling for a ton of prospects this cycle. Nebraska seems to have the edge on the Tigers for in-state four-star defensive end Titan Davis. Just relative, it just in terms of just talking head to head, I think Nebraska's done a better job in that recruitment. He's considering Missouri, he's considering Nebraska, Michigan, and Alabama. And I actually think Alabama and Michigan pose a bigger threat to Nebraska than Missouri does. At least, as we're sitting here entering June, and he's scheduled to make an official visit to Nebraska. He currently doesn't have a date to officially visit Missouri. I do think that could happen, but I think just the fact that there's a Nebraska OB schedule and not a Missouri one kind of tells you, what he thinks about both schools. Nebraska's also battling Missouri for Camden Jensen, four-star tight end out of Colorado. Nebraska's battling a few Big Ten programs for Jensen, but also battling Missouri. Missouri was one of the first SEC offers for Jensen. Nebraska was one of the first Big Ten offers for Jensen. Though these two programs have been involved in this battle for a bit now, it's about coming to a close. And there's a chance Jensen doesn't end up at either of these schools. That's just the state of his recruitment right now. He's got some legit good national options. We'll talk about him again towards the end of this video because he comes up a couple times, but. Missouri's one in that recruitment. Another one, I think Nebraska has the edge on Missouri on is four-star running back Zephyr Walker, who, really isn't considering Missouri anymore. I think there's a big win for Nebraska to earn that nod over Missouri in his top schools list. And Nebraska is going to have a very real shot to land Zephyr Walker. The real threats for Nebraska in that recruitment are Kansas at this point, Kansas State, and Oklahoma. Notre Dame's in that mix too, but Notre Dame's picked up some running back commitments as of late, two running back commitments as of late that I think will see them bow out of Zephyr Walker's recruitment. But yeah, I do think this is going to come down to Nebraska, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Kansas State's still in there, but I do think it's going to come down to those three schools. We'll talk about Oklahoma in a second. One recruitment I think Missouri has the edge on Nebraska on is four-star athlete Jacob Eberhardt, one of the more fascinating athletes in this 26 class. I don't think we've talked about him enough. I think he's a guy that deserves a ton more attention. I mean, schools have been going through to go see him at Kirkwood High School out there in Missouri. He plays for former NFL star wide receiver Jeremy Maclin in Kirkwood in the greater St. Louis area. He recently picked up an offer from Alabama. He's got schools like Tennessee in the mix, got Florida, Miami, got a bunch of national schools, LSU in the mix. And in-state Missouri, in-state Missouri's done a really good job. I think if you were to, I think it's a wide open race, but I think if you were to call it right now, I think in-state Missouri, Illinois, and LSU probably have a slight edge on Nebraska right now. And the big thing with Eberhard is going to be where does each school see him? Some schools see him as a safety at the next level. Some schools see him as a linebacker. I know he's put on some weight. He's standing closer to 6'3", 220 right now. So that projection is kind of changing from safety to linebacker for a ton of schools. And Nebraska sees him as an athlete that can play on both sides of the ball. He could also play receiver. I think he's got some promising traits out of the receiver as well. But I do think ultimately he ends up on the defensive side of the ball. But that's one where I think Missouri has the edge on Nebraska right now. Same thing with Isaac Jensen, and that's just in a recruitment, kind of opposite of Zephyr Walker. Nebraska made the top group for Walker. Missouri didn't. On the flip side, Missouri made the top group for Jensen, and it's a prospect out of Millard South, and Nebraska didn't. And I think Missouri's going to have a very real shot to land Jensen. I think Iowa State's the biggest threat. I think he's got a couple other national options he's considering, but I think he ends up staying in the Midwest. And as of right now, I think Missouri's the school that lands him. But I'm very excited to see how Jensen feels coming out of some of his official visits. And then the other one, this is another one where you kind of have to give the nod to Missouri. They got the head-to-head win over Nebraska at the very least. Is for Keenan Harris, four-star linebacker out of St. Louis University High. This for a long time was a Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Missouri battle. And this spring it's been weird. I mean, it's one of those weird developments this cycle where Nebraska kind of bowed out of that recruitment, turned their attention elsewhere at the linebacker position, and so Nebraska's essentially been replaced in that top group by Iowa. And so now he's going to make official visits to Iowa, Missouri, and Oklahoma. And I think all three schools have a very fair shot, but I think Missouri are very, very good odds of keeping him home. I think he's going to stay home. I think he's going to play for the Tigers, and that's just a tough one for Nebraska to swallow, even though they did kind of bow out themselves from that recruitment. Speaking of Oklahoma, Nebraska does have a few recruitments in common with Oklahoma. The Sooners just beat out Nebraska for four-star linebacker Ja'Cory Smith out of Arkansas. Nebraska had amped up the pressure on Smith this spring. We're scheduled to get him for an official visit June 13th. Instead, before he even gets a chance to see Nebraska, he's now committed to the Sooners. That's a big win for the Sooners and a tough loss for Nebraska. Oklahoma and Nebraska are practically head-to-head for four-star offensive lineman Deacon Schmidt. Schmidt is one of Nebraska's top interior line targets out of Windsor, Colorado. There's a few other national schools involved, but I do think this recruitment comes down to Nebraska and Oklahoma. And yeah, he's going to make official visits to both schools. I right now just entering June, a little more confidence out of Norman for Schmidt, but I don't think this one's over. I don't think he's made a decision, and I think Nebraska's going to have a very real shot to get over the top in June. Nebraska's also battling Oklahoma for Valdon Sohn, who's been at the top of mind for the last couple of days. Nebraska defensive line coach Terry Braden went all the way out to Sweden to go meet with his mom. His mom still lives out there. Of course, we've talked about Sohn, international prospect out of Sweden, who now plays his high school football in Virginia. Four-star prospect, Nebraska's top defensive tackle target. Yeah, he recently announced his top schools list, but kind of sources indicate this is going to come down to Florida, Oklahoma, and Nebraska. I think USC is in the mix. Texas is also another program that could potentially surge as we enter, his official visit season. But yeah, Oklahoma is one of the top contenders. They made him feel like a priority. They visited him multiple times here in the spring. But Nebraska going out there to Sweden, specifically Terry Braden going out there to Sweden, sitting down in the living room with Sohn's family while EJ Bartel was in Virginia meeting with Sohn. It made a big, big impression. And if Nebraska wins this thing and gets over the top and beats out Florida and Oklahoma for Sohn, it's going to be because of that trip from Braden, because that made a big, big impact in that recruitment. Like I mentioned, Keenan Harris earlier, I think that's an Oklahoma Missouri battle now, and Nebraska's bowed out. But again, it's talking purely head to head, one where Oklahoma edged out Nebraska. Talking about a few national programs Nebraska keeps running into, I think we have to talk about Miami. Miami, of course, just landed Jackson Cantwell, five-star offensive tackle, a prospect Nebraska was after for a really long time, but ultimately didn't make the final cut for him and haven't been involved in that recruitment practically since, the end of his junior season. But still, Miami, big win for them. Obviously, ponied up from the NIL standpoint, did a really good job pitching him on just the development, the track record with Mario Cristobal, Alex Mirabel. Of course, one of the more talked about recruitments for Nebraska here in this 26 cycle is the push to flip Jordan Campbell away from the Hurricanes. Campbell out of Miami Carroll City, now playing at Miami Northwestern, actually, the powerhouse program down there in South Florida is been committed to Miami since 2023, and Nebraska's pushing. And I think if anyone's going to be able to flip them away, it's going to be Nebraska. I think they're pressing all the right buttons. They got him on campus twice this spring, but this is a recruitment Nebraska's going to have to be patient with. I don't think anything's going to happen imminently. I don't even know if he's going to make any other official visits this summer besides the one he's got scheduled to Miami. If Nebraska's going to win this thing, it's going to be because they're patient and they stay consistent, just like they did last year with Dawson Merritt and Cortez Mills when those two guys were committed elsewhere. But that's just such a massive battle for both these programs right now. Miami's also one of the bigger contenders for Devin Jackson, four-star safety out of Orlando First Academy, a top priority for Nebraska at the defensive back position here in this 2026 cycle. A few other programs we'll talk about involved in that recruitment, but Miami is a real contender there for both Jackson and his teammate Danny Odom with him. Nebraska's done a really good job with both those guys. Addison Williams was just out in Orlando to see both of them. Nebraska's scheduled to get both Jackson and Odom back for an official visit on June 20th, and I like their chances of landing at least one of those guys. I don't know if they land both, but I like their chances of landing at least one. And then Ryan Murray, four-star center, Nebraska's top center target here in this 2026 cycle. It's Miami, working to keep him home. He's out of Miami South Ridge. They've done a really good job of making him feel like a priority. They've gotten him on campus more than anybody to this point. And of course, he's kind of pitching the opportunity to stay closer to home. Again, the development from Alex Mirabel and Mario Cristobal, they got those guys recruited and then developed Jackson Powers Johnson, who was one of the top centers in college football a few years ago and is now, starting for the Las Vegas Raiders. I think that really stands out. I think that's, something that uh, Miami gets to say and use on the recruiting trail that Nebraska doesn't really have right now. Or at least this current staff doesn't have. Of course, Nebraska has Cam Jurgens, but that wasn't this staff that recruited or developed him. So I think Miami's got the edge heading into official visit season, but Nebraska's gone all out this spring. Nebraska's gotten them on campus multiple times. Donovan Raiola went in home with Murray last week. And if Nebraska comes out on top, it's because they impressed in June. And Donovan Raiola just pressing the right buttons. He's done a really good job with landing his top interior targets over the last few years. I think he can get it done, but I'm very wary of the Hurricanes and obviously the proximity to home in that recruitment. Miami's also involved. I talked about Jacob Eberhardt earlier. I think Miami's a top contender there. They really like him. They're really pushing for him as a defensive athlete that can play safety or linebacker. They've got a very, very real shot in that recruitment. Sticking in the state of Florida, Nebraska's battling Florida, the Gators, for a couple prospects. Headlined by Nebraska commit CJ Brona. Nebraska has had Brona committed since the fall, but his recruitment exploded coming out of his junior season as schools got watched his tape. They saw the track times he was putting down during the spring, and he's absolutely exploded on the recruiting trail. And now a four-star prospect, one of the top cornerbacks in the country, and has the in-state Gators pushing really hard to keep him home. I think if anyone's going to be able to flip him away from Nebraska, I think it's going to be Florida. Billy Napier's taken this recruitment personally. He's been involved, and I'll say this, and I'll have something more at Inside Nebraska .com here soon. I think the Huskers have a real good shot of keeping Bronock committed. I know some people are just kind of dismissing Nebraska here. They think he's going to flip inevitably. I don't think that's the case. I think Nebraska is going to have an opportunity to make a case in June when they get him back for an official visit. That Nebraska is the place for him. That he should stick with his commitment. But a final decision is coming in July. I think he's gonna make these official visits. Set to see Florida State, and Penn State, and then I think he's going to settle down after that and make a decision. Nebraska going to get him in town in June as well. And like I said, I think Nebraska has a very good shot of holding on to his commitment. But entering June, I have to say, if it's going to be anyone that does it, it's going to be Florida. Florida's also battling Nebraska. If I mentioned earlier, Valdez, I think this comes down to Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Florida. I think the Gators are the favorite for Zone, at least until this last week when Nebraska made that all-out push, sending Terry Braden to Sweden to go meet with his mom, sending Egypt Bartel to Virginia to go meet with him. I think Nebraska's aggressiveness this spring has really resonated with Zone and the people around him, the people that are, kind of helping him navigate this recruiting process and figure out where he should go. Nebraska's done a lot of really good there, but Florida's had momentum for a while, and they're the school essentially to beat heading into June. Nebraska's also battling Florida for two four-star tight end targets. We talked about Cayman and Jensen earlier. Florida's a school scheduled to get him on an official visit as well. I think they're a real contender in that recruitment. They're also a real contender for Lincoln Watkins, four-star tight end. Nebraska is working to get out of Michigan. At this point, Watkins doesn't have an official visit scheduled to Florida, but they offered earlier this spring. That offer made a big impression. I think Nebraska's the favorite for Watkins as we enter June. I think they're going to be able to get over the top. They're hosting him June 20th. That's an important weekend. A lot of other top targets coming in that weekend too. I think Nebraska's going to be able to get over the top with Watkins, but I am, a little worried about Florida because of when they entered this recruitment and, the push they're making. Yeah, and then outside of Florida, I think just another school worth mentioning is Penn State. That's just seeing Penn State in a few recruitments. Mentioned CJ Brona. Penn State's another school scheduled to get him on an official visit, and they've done a good job. But I think the proximity, I think the distance is just a little too much. I don't think Penn State's going to be the one that flips Brona away. But crazier things have happened. Penn State does a really good job on these official visits, making sudden surges in recruitments and making guys feel at home in Happy Valley. But yeah, like I said, I think entering June, I think the biggest threat to Nebraska for Brona is Florida. I do think Penn State is the favorite for Luke Sorensen, though. Four-star tight end target. Nebraska loves out of Anaheim Servite. They're battling a few schools. There are a couple Big Ten schools. UCLA's involved, USC's involved, Penn State's involved, and there's a couple others. But I do think this comes down to Nebraska, Penn State, and UCLA. And right now, entering June, um, have to like where the Nittany Lions sit. The Nittany Lions just producing Tyler Warren last year, being able to just have that in their back pocket and here's the thing with Luke Sorensen. Sorensen wants a role. He's talking to him. He's very clear in what he's looking for at the next level. He wants the school to properly show him, this is how he's going to be used. He's going to be used, multiple ways in the offense, going to be a featured part of the offense. He's going to have the opportunity to kind of showcase his versatility as a guy that can line up in line, can line up outside, can even line up in the backfield on occasion and run some routes out of the backfield. And Penn State gets to point to what they did with Tyler Warren last year and where he got drafted and say, hey, we'll just do this with you next year. Nebraska can't do that, at least not right now. That's, I think, the vision for Nebraska eventually with the tight end position, with Heinrich Haarberg, Carter Nelson, and those guys, is to move those guys and make those guys a focal part of the offense. But they won't get to showcase that until the fall. And so entering this final stretch, it's going to be about can Nebraska or effectively show Sorensen that he can be a feature part of the offense and he can be a guy that is going to be used in a variety of ways within Nebraska's offense. Nebraska's also battling Penn State for four-star cornerback Cameron Hamill out of Arizona. I don't think Penn State ultimately lands him. I actually don't know if Nebraska ultimately lands Hamill. I think Oregon and Texas A&M are the two favorites in that recruitment. But rounding out his top four are Nebraska, Penn State. It's worth mentioning both those programs. Penn State just had Hamill in town for an official visit. Nebraska schedules to get him in town next month here. But if out of those four, if you had to call a dark horse, if you had to call someone that can pull it off and can overcome Oregon and Texas A&M. I favor Nebraska over Penn State. I like what Nebraska's done here. I think getting him on campus early this spring really impressed him. The facilities, the coaching staff. This is a guy that John Butler's been after practically since John Butler took the job. It was one of the first targets he went out and offered and made a priority. And so, Nebraska's been in this recruitment for a while. And if they get it done, it's because John Butler prioritized him so early, and Addison Williams picked up right where Butler left off, and assisted in getting them over the top. The last guy, Nebraska, just worth mentioning in this Nebraska Penn State head to head is Danny Odom. Odom is originally from Pennsylvania, and I think that opportunity to go home is something that he's intrigued by. If Penn State lands him, it's not going to be just because of that. I do think it's something that is attractive, no doubt. I think the opportunity to go move back home after playing his high school ball in Florida is something that he'd be interested in, but. Ultimately, I don't think that's going to be deciding. I think Penn State's going to have to show him a lot more. They haven't really had him on campus recently. Nebraska has. I think Nebraska's been more aggressive this spring in making him feel like a priority. And on that note, appreciate you guys tuning in. I know this is a bit of a different episode. Just thought it'd be something fun to discuss and run through. Any schools I missed, I know there's a couple other contenders. I know there's a couple of recruits Nebraska battling Florida State for, and of course, there's a personal connection with Terrence Knighton and Evan Cooper and Tony White on that staff. But it makes sense. There's some overlap. At the end of the day, recruiting is a relationships business, and these guys at Nebraska built these relationships with guys that, of course, Nebraska's also recruiting. So there's a few battles there, but and not to this, not like not compared to Nebraska going up against Florida or Miami right now. I think Nebraska has a few more irons in the fire against Miami and Florida than they do with Florida State. Kansas potentially, but Nebraska kind of backed off a couple guys before they ended up committing to Kansas. Technically consider some of those head-to-head wins, but ultimately it was Nebraska resetting their board and moving on from some guys, and it was Kansas straight out beating Nebraska for them. I will say, one real head-to-head win for Kansas was J.J. Dunnigan, the four-star safety out of Manhattan, Kansas. And another one could be Deshaun Walker, the four-star running back we talked about earlier. I think Kansas is a real threat in that recruitment. They've got a better shot than Missouri does for sure. They've got a better shot than Notre Dame does at this point, in my opinion, too. And Yeah, I think it's going to end up coming down to the Jayhawks and the Huskers for Walker. And yeah, outside of that, Oregon, you could potentially mention Oregon, but I think you're going to see Oregon and Nebraska mentioned down the line more than you are in 2026. They're going to have a couple of battles here this cycle. Like I mentioned, battling for Kelvin Obot, battling for Devin Jackson, and a couple others, but not to the extent that I think it's worth mentioning as a true rivalry at this point. Like I said, appreciate you guys tuning in, and that'll do it for us over here at Inside Nebraska.